Good morning. We'll just give a couple of more minutes for folks to join. The participant numbers are still going up, so I'll just hang on a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Right, I think we can get started now. So good afternoon and welcome to the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety's or Energy Safety's public meeting to consider adoption of the 2023 Executive Compensation Structure Submission Guidelines. Firstly, I'd like to confirm that Energy Safety's Deputy Director, Melissa Semser, delegated the authority for me, Lucy Morgans, Programme Manager of the Electric Safety Policy Division, to adopt these guidelines. If we just move on to the agenda slide. Thank you. So today we'll be taking public comment and going over the changes that Energy Safety has made to the draft 2023 Executive Compensation Guidelines following the public comments received. I'll now hand over to Adrian Ownby, a Senior Analyst in the Policy Division, to provide an overview of today's meeting.
Okay. Next slide, please. Thank you. Hi, my name is Adrian Ownby. I'm a public utility regulatory analyst with the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety, and I guess the lead on the development of the Executive Compensation Structure Submission Guidelines. So before we proceed with public comment, I take a moment to talk about the purpose of the guidelines. Next slide, please. So every year, pursuant to Public Utilities Code Section 8389 E4 and E6, Energy Safety evaluates electrical corporations' executive compensation structure submission and approves or denies them. An Energy Safety approved executive compensation structure is necessary for the issuance of a safety certification. That structure must meet the principles outlined in the relevant statutes, which I just mentioned. Energy Safety's guidelines operationalize the statutory provisions. They provide for consistency in the submissions and provide for increased internal consistency in the reviews and decisions regarding those submissions. Put simply, if an electrical corporation wants a safety certification, Energy Safety has to approve their executive compensation structure. I'm not going into any depth on the statutory provisions here, but I will note that those provisions are replicated at the beginning and in attachment 4 of the guidelines. And I want to thank you all again for attending this meeting. Next slide, please. So now we can proceed upon to open up the meeting for public comments on the updated draft 2023 Executive Compensation Guidelines. If you wish to comment, press the raise hand button on Zoom. Participants will be unmuted in order of hands raised. Dial-in participants will need to press #2 to raise a hand. We will limit the comments to 5 minutes, which is more than enough time, I would hope. And we'll end the comment period if necessary to keep the meeting on our schedule, which is long. We have quite a bit of time today. It's 2 hours. I think before we actually begin with the raised hand comments, I have a written comment submitted by Paul Marconi on behalf of Bear Valley Electric Service, and I want to read that into the record. So, Bear Valley appreciates Energy Safety's efforts to improve the 2023 Executive Compensation Guidelines. However, similar to the earlier draft of the guidelines, the final draft guidelines are contrary to California law regarding its presumption that all utility executive officers are presumed to have compensation contracts under California law. The statutory language in section 8389E6A limits its applicability to a utility that has new or amended contracts for its executive officers by adopting the definitions of new contracts and amended contracts in the draft guidelines that include the presumption that all utility executives have compensation contracts under California law. Energy Safety has improperly attempted to apply the requirements of section 8389E6A to all utilities, regardless of whether they actually have contracts with their executive officers. As Bear Valley pointed out in its September, I believe that should be October 5th comments, but it says September 5th comments, there is no legal basis for such a presumption, and it is clearly contrary to the statutory language adopted by the legislature. Although the final guidelines eliminate the sentence in the definition of amended contracts that presumes all utility executive officers have compensation contracts under California law, the sentence remains in the definition of new contract in the final guidelines. For that reason, and consistent with its October 5th comments, Bear Valley believes the applicability of section 8389E6A in the final guidelines to all utilities, regardless of whether they actually have contracts with their executive officers, is contrary to the statutory provisions of section 8389E6A and therefore unlawful. Bear Valley requests the Energy Safety delete the last sentence in the definition of new contract in the final guidelines. And that's it for Bear Valley's statement. So we can open the up to anyone who wants to make verbal comments now. I'm not seeing any hands raised. We'll give it a couple more minutes if somebody decides to raise their hands and make comments. So we'll simply give it, I think, another 2 more minutes. Lucy, are you comfortable with that? And then we'll move on. Okay.
Yeah. Thanks,
We have a comment from Sergey Trachtenberg in the Q&A.
Okay. Let me check Q&A here. Okay. It simply says SCE supports Bear Valley's written comments. Okay, I think we can go ahead and move on. I don't see anybody raising their hand for comments, and I don't see any additional Q&A or chatted comments. So if you go ahead and head to the next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, you'd already moved to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to advance to the portion of the public meeting where we provide an overview of the changes we've made to the draft 2023 executive compensation guidelines. I'm going to outline what I would characterize as noteworthy or notable changes to the guidelines based on comments received and additional internal review. Not covered in this presentation are multiple clarifying or wordsmithing changes to the guidelines that are not particularly noteworthy. Let's go ahead to the next slide now. Sorry about that. Okay, so we have 5 here, 5 slides to go through on these changes. One is change to the individual performance modifier reporting that we're asking for. And the second is a 2022 short-term incentive plan ties to other metrics reporting. The third is changes to the significant portion and minimization requirements that were in the draft guidelines. And then we have changes to the supplemental executive retirement plan reporting. And finally, we have some changes to the assigned commissioner rule reporting to discuss. Next slide, please. So the individual performance modifier reporting, this was a concern for several utilities, and what we've done is we've clarified the reasons for IPMs required in table 3A.3. We clarified that and noted that providing a broad category when those reasons are not safety related is acceptable. And I give a couple of examples here: other non-safety related or superior financial performance, etc. However, reasons for adjustments that are safety and or WMP related need to be specific. I'll note here that if this clarification is still insufficient to address the electrical corporation's concerns, information can be submitted confidentially. So you can submit all of those reasons confidentially if the broad categorization is not sufficient. Next slide, please. So we've made changes to the short-term incentive plan ties to other metrics, the reporting associated with that. The requested STIP data regarding how executive compensation structure metrics relate to wildfire mitigation plan metrics, safety performance metrics, and safety and operational metrics has been expanded to include information on the 2022 short-term incentive plan. The data requested is identical to the data requested for the 2023 STIP in the September 15, 2022 draft guidelines. There's no additional data. This is section 3H and attachment 1 now. And this is just intended to provide us a year-over-year comparison that we can consider when we're reviewing that section of the guidelines responses. Next slide, please. So changes to the significant portion and minimization requirements. We've removed the threshold requirements related to defining or clarifying a significant portion and the minimization or elimination of indirect or ancillary compensation not aligned with shareholder and taxpayer interest in the electric corporation language that's contained in Public Utilities Code section 8389 E6A3 and E6A4. There really is nothing else to say here about that. For 2023, we simply won't have those thresholds as part of the guidelines. Next slide, please. We've made some changes to the supplemental executive retirement plan reporting. SERP or SERPs. SERP reporting has been separated from other indirect or ancillary compensation reporting. A separate table has been added for reporting the number of years of credited service. The present value of accumulated benefits is a percentage of the total direct compensation, and the cash balance account lump sum value as a percentage of the total direct compensation. For 2023, SERP data will not be considered in assessing whether a submitted structure meets the principles of Public Utilities Code section 8389E4 and E6A. Next slide, please. We've made some changes to the assigned commissioner ruling reporting. The required information template, which is attachment 1, not in attachment 1, is attachment 1. It includes a new section for electrical corporations to describe how their executive compensation structures are supportive of assigned commissioner ruling executive compensation proposal 9. We'll shorthand that to ACR 9. This section's been added for consistency of reporting among electrical corporations. By way of some background here, the California Public Utilities Commission has obligated PG&E to comply with the requirements of ACR 9. PG&E must note in its submissions how it is addressing the various additional requirements of ACR 9. Other electrical corporations are encouraged to review and consider adopting measures from the ACR 9 in the spirit of transparency and furthering the purpose of AB 1054. This is a new section. It's section 8 in attachment 1. And the reporting is structured to match the elements of ACR 9 with 9 separate fields for reporting. Just basically, it's a list of the requirements and then fields for the utility to use to report. The intent here is just to provide some uniformity and structure to the electrical corporation's reporting on this subject, and we're not expanding the applicability of ACR 9 at all in this. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move on to the portion of this public meeting where we consider adoption of the 2023 Executive Compensation Structure Submission Guidelines. And I'll turn this back over to Lucy.
Thanks very much, Adrian. So Government Code 15475.6 requires no less than 10 days public notice of a meeting where guidelines will be adopted. This same code also provides that substantive changes to guidelines shall not be adopted without at least 30 days written notice to the public and opportunity to comment. On September 15th, 2022, Energy Safety published the draft revised 2023 Executive Compensation Structure Submission Guidelines, along with the notice of an approval meeting, or an adoption meeting, sorry, on the 2023 Executive Compensation Docket with service to the associated service list. Initial comments were due October 5th, 2022, and reply comments were due October 17th, 2022. On November 21st, 2022, Energy Safety published a notice of postponement of the meeting. On November 10th, 2022, Energy Safety published notice of this adoption meeting. This provided more than 30 days notice of the changes to the guidelines and the adoption meeting. The comment period for the guidelines was 30 days with comments due November 7th, 2022. Earlier in today's presentation, Adrian outlined the changes that Energy Safety made to the draft 2023 Executive Compensation Structure Submission Guidelines. Energy Safety has considered both written and verbal comments in its revision of the 2023 Executive Compensation Structure Submission Guidelines. These guidelines provide guidance and requirements for the electrical corporation's executive compensation structure submissions. The final 2023 Executive Compensation Structure Submission Guidelines are hereby adopted. A clean version of the guidelines will be published on Energy Safety's website and on the 2023 Executive Compensation Docket with service to the associated service list by close of business by close of business on November 29th, so that's tomorrow, 2022. Let me hand back to Adrian to talk you through the next steps.
Okay. Next slide, please. So Energy Safety previously published the schedule for the 2023 executive compensation structure submissions and reviews, and I would encourage you all to download that file. You can find it in docket 2023-EC. The current deadline for submissions is March 13, 2023, and all deadlines in the submissions and review process are subject to change. And I would also encourage you to subscribe to the executive compensation docket to get notifications of any such changes. I think that's it. Next slide, please. So we've come to the end of the presentation and the end of the meeting. I want to thank you all for your participation in today's public meeting. And I guess the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you all.